I'm Izzy, and I'm an undergraduate student in the Sustainability and Contemporary Studies departments at Dalhousie University and University of King's College. I'm also a cluster student at Situating Science. This is the third episode in a series of podcasts complementing the upcoming Hype in Science event, happening at University of King's College on December 7th. Hype in Science, or How Can Respectable Journals Publish Such Crap, will take the shape of 6 case studies of overselling, misrepresentation, or biasing in the presentation of scientific research. Voices from Harvard, UBC, Elsevier, and Dalhousie will be presenting case studies from their own fields and fueling discussion by casting a critical eye towards the peer review process. The process of the rise of a paper to celebrity status will also be under scrutiny. Is the search for breakthrough papers verging on fetishism? And how will trustworthiness in research be ensured in the context of the current collapse of the peer-reviewed system? Today we're talking with Dr. Florian Maderspacher, Senior Editor to the Elsevier-affiliated journal Current Biology. Dr. Maderspacher's talk, titled Victory Over the Genes, The Rise of Epigenetics in Public and Scientific Discourse. Dr. Maderspacher, could you say a few words about what your talk will be about?
Yeah, well, I'm going to explore that field of epigenetics a little bit, which has come to the forefront both in the public perception, but also within science. It's a burgeoning, very hype infiltrated field, and I'm going to explore a little bit, where this hype is coming from, why it's falling on such a fertile ground in the public discussion, what misconceptions are there about epigenetics, both within science but also in the public domain, and I'm going to shed a little bit also light on the biology behind it. So it's going to be a tour through biology with some side notes on the societal and philosophical, if you wish, impacts.
Well, given that Lysenkoism will be discussed, could you please give us an idea of what Lysenkoism is and what distinguishes its traditional form to new Lysenkoism?
Well, I have to be careful because I don't think really there is a new Lysenkoism. That's Ford invented that a little bit to spike things up a little bit. But Lysenko traditionally, Trofim Lysenko was a scientist in the Soviet Union who in the late 1920s and 30s, together with the rise of Joseph Stalin, became the dominant figure in Soviet biology. And he started out from very humble beginnings. He comes from a farmer family, and he was a simple agronomist, so he was studying wheat crops. And he he didn't actually discover a phenomenon that's already well known. It's called vernalization, which means that certain parts of the wheat crop, they need a cold spot to be able to grow. And he just found that he can induce this vernalization response. And that, some of this had actual impacts on the agricultural practices in the Soviet Union and positive effects. But then Lysenko became such a prominent figure and was hyped so much, and he made a lot of false claims of things that the vernalization response should be heritable, or one could be able to transfer it onto plants through simple grafting techniques, all sorts of stuff that had no scientific basis whatsoever, but which was then used to guide agricultural practices. And what's more, he was very harmful to many biologists who did not subscribe to this view that, there is the environmental component is so determining of what happens to that plant rather than the genetic component. And that, of course, sat very well with the overall communist leftist ideology, namely that, you are not born into something, everything is malleable, everything can be changed, everything can be turned around. And this led really to science becoming entirely entrenched in ideological debates, up to a point where in 1948, when Lysenko was already head of the Academy of Sciences, they actually outlawed the classic model of genetics that we know in the West to be, of course, we know that it's true, it's the laws of Gregor Mendel, the work of Thomas Hunt Morgan. Lots of people have empirically work these things out, It's not a matter of ideological debate. Yet in the Soviet Union, it was practically outlawed. And really, Lysenko is responsible for a large part for the fact that the Soviet Union, which, for instance, in physics, mathematics, was hugely influential, played absolutely no role in the biology of the 20th century. I mean, this sounds harsh, but one can really say that. And even people within the Soviet Union, like Andrei Sakharov, said, he's responsible not only for the downfall of Soviet science, for the prosecution of people. And he was a really bad guy, and was until the 1960s, after Khrushchev, Lysenko was in a controlling power. Then he was taken down and he died in 1976.
So now that we've already discussed what Lysenkoism is, I wanted to ask if there's any particular reason that scientific research in certain cases is being used towards ideological ends, and further, why is a scientific case a convincing one for reinforcing non-scientific ideals?
I think the first part of the question, is interesting because science is, of course, science, the way we see it, has this objective nature. We see it as empirical, and the facts are the facts. But, the facts themselves are not always something that is particularly meaningful for the people at large. What's meaningful for them is an interpretation of those facts. So a pure fact-driven scientific research is not meaningful. It's meaningful in the context of interpretations and certain hypotheses. And of course, these interpretations are contentious because, like I'm going to talk about in the case of epigenetics, this of course goes to the very nature of who we are, right? This idea, like, if you set epigenetics against the case of sort of genetic determinism, this idea that your core, your DNA is something you cannot control. You've inherited, let's say a breast cancer risk allele from your family. That's out of your control. And that's, of course, something that's really disconcerting. That notion is disconcerting to people. So the idea that, it touches on the very essence of sort of what we are and who we are. And, of course, this is going to be exploited by political, ideological, commercial movements because they want to tap into this, because it is an issue that is so important. The second part of your question you have to repeat for me again, I'm sorry.
Why is a scientific case a convincing one for reinforcing non-scientific ideals?
Well, that's because, like I said, science, of course, comes with the extra weight of, hard evidence. In the ideal case, people do experiments, and if they do them right, there is, of course, in an ideal world, it's reproducible, so everybody can do that experiment. It's a truth that holds independent of the particular circumstance, and if it's done right, like we heard this morning by Rosie Redfield, if the scrutiny process works, it works towards finding out what really is. I think there is a reason to believe that science still is in pursuit of the truth, and of course that carries much more weight than philosophical argument or an argument of first principles. And in a way, I think the rise of Lysenko to power is exactly that. Of course, this idea that we have here someone who can put a scientific foundation to an ideology, that was, of course, very desirable. Just in the same way, of course, that in the West, by extreme right-wing governments, of course, the National Socialists in Germany, first and foremost, also employed the knowledge of genetics and the ideas that, there's differences in genetic makeup, and not only are there differences, but these differences are differences, not just differences, but quality differences. And of course also in the United States, in Sweden, eugenics was widely used in the 1920s, 30s, so it needs to be seen in that. It was not only in the Soviet Union that science was used in an ideological way, it was also used in the West.
As an editor of a very well-recognized hub of research, do you feel any moral responsibility in what you publish, and what does the fielding process for papers look like?
No, I think that's a very important question, and I feel bad for not actually talking about this in my talk, but what wanted me to talk about the epigenetics, so fine, that's what we're going to talk about. Makes it easier for me in a way. But of course, this is a very big question. That's a question we discuss almost every day, and the word hype is, of course, has a very negative connotation. Don't believe the hype and so on. But there's also a positive side for that. And it's this positive side where I see my role as a journal. So we're, of course, primarily we're serving the scientific communication among scientists. But we're also sort of the interface between what gets from the domain of science into the public domain. So, there's science journalists and then there's sort of general science journalists. That's sort of the touching point. And of course, I think the public needs to be informed and educated about science. First of all, because it's inherently interesting. It's part of culture. People know everything about the movies, but they know very little about biology. And I wish they would know more about biology. There's also a moral obligation because the public pays for the science through tax money and so on. And so the scientists have to give knowledge back, not only for themselves, but also knowledge that the public can use, appreciate, and do something with it. And so, genetics or epigenetics is, of course, part of that. You're getting something real out of this. The fact that you can do now a breast cancer test is, of course, the fruit of hundreds and thousands of people who have worked towards identifying these genes, towards screening patients, towards devising tests and things like that. So it is important that science is communicated, but, it needs to be communicated in the right way, and there needs to be a critical eye. And I think, we try very hard to strike that balance, to not just go for the hype in its own right. The hype needs to be, justified in the sense that this is really meaningful and that it is really important.
In terms of the morality, you made a really great point about how research has led up to really great innovations such as breast cancer testing. But what can you say about the possibility that the research that you present, the possibility that it has ultimately negative effects, such as weapons of mass destruction or something?
Yeah, of course, that's of course a huge. That's a concern that's been besetting science ever since I don't know when Aristotle or Archimedes they were building weapons, So it's an old problem. But I think in a way, again, it is the science provides a foundation for an application. And I think the application, whether that application is being implemented and what you do with it, that's a decision the society has to make. But of course, the society can only make that decision if it understands as well as possible, what is going on and what the implications of that research are. The best example at the moment is genetically modified organisms, of course, I think. And it's interesting actually because the cultural divide is so big between Europe and the US, but there's really, a debate on what we should do with this. Should we really modify everything just to maximize profits for some agricultural companies? But again, I think the decision lies within the domain of, economy or politics. Whether you want a company to control these things. And it's funny because people mostly in the public debate, it's always being made about the science. So are GMOs bad for you? There's no real evidence for that GMOs really cause any bad things. It's in my mind, it's a completely political and economical decision whether you want that and whether you want to have people who control your seeds.
Well, thanks for chatting with us today, Dr. Maderspacher, and thank you to the listeners for tuning in. For more information on Situating Science and the Hype in Science event, visit our website at situsci.ca. That's situsci.ca.